Well, thank you for joining us today. I am excited to be joined today again by Robin Keating and Stuart Smith. We're here discussing what is poverty. And so today we're going to kind of dive into how do we understand what poverty is and how does that understanding shape our response to it as the church and just as people in general. What are the best ways we can respond to it? How can we, especially in the church, how can we do better at understanding it and understanding what our neighbors are experiencing? So to start, Robin and Stuart, thanks again for being with me here again for another week. I would love to just hear, to start, what do you think poverty is? How do you understand it at a real, just, couple sentences?
I'll give you my before and after Love Inc. How's that? So before I came to Love Inc., if you would have just said, what's poverty? I would have said it's a lack of money. That would have been my understanding. I didn't think of it in any other way. Now that I've been a part of Love Inc., I think it's a lack of anything. That you're impoverished from material things to relationships to spiritually, emotionally, any of those areas can be a poverty or a lack of.
Yeah, I think especially from Love Inc., but then also looking at Chalmers has done a good, extensive amount of work on that, and other agencies as well. But one of my books that I'm very fond of, Becoming Whole by Brian Fikkert, he talks about, and we have our own philosophy similar to this as well, but it's how we are doing in those four areas of what would be our total being: God, creation, others, and the material things as well. And so for us at Love Inc. is what we call the PERS, the physical, emotional, relational, and spiritual parts. So I think that when we talk about poverty, the easiest thing to put our fingers on is, what are they lacking materially? And that's the easiest for us to supplement as well, because it takes very little investment, and maybe even little in the sense that it might be financial investment, but still little, because what we're pouring into that person is just to supplement for whatever material lack they might have. Investing in emotional, relational, can be very costly and very expensive. But if you don't invest in those three areas specifically first, then it's very difficult, if it's possible, to invest in their spiritual lack. And so I would say that the idea of poverty is, where is a person lacking in those four areas? And then I'm sure you have more questions following, but I would say that would be the first part that I would look at, is what poverty is.
Yeah, I like that you both are getting at more than just the material things that we like. That I think generally our society kind of looks at that as the indicator of poverty. But I think a big challenge when you just measure it physically is when, you might have plenty of stuff. You might have plenty of income coming in. But if you're missing relationships, if you don't know how to manage your emotions, if your spiritual life is really struggling, those material things can go away really, really quick. And you might not be in poverty technically, but very quickly you can lose a lot when those other parts of your life aren't healthy either. So to kind of help us understand where your understanding of poverty is coming, tell me a little bit about your personal experiences with poverty. I mean, you don't have to get into all the details or stuff, but if you've faced, had times in your life where you faced challenges, whether that's financially, maybe relationally, spiritually, emotionally, right? What has your experience personally been with poverty?
Yeah, I think for me, my family and we've experienced all of the levels of those poverty in those areas. We've had, so I got married at 19 and my wife was 18 at the time, and we didn't know what a checkbook was or what money was. We didn't understand what credit was and bills were. I'm very grateful for our parents for a lot of help and assistance in the sense of training and educating. But especially when you get married that young and you move from literally going from our bedroom, like my bedroom, going into now an apartment, and now having to figure out like to live with this other person, and we got to pay rent. Well, that was a very difficult and in some ways monetarily and materially dark area of my life as well, where there was several. I don't know if we ever got evicted, but we definitely missed a lot of rent payments. We've got our lights shut off. We've had bills canceled. We've had cell phones shut off. I mean, we've had, like, I remember I think we talked about this on an earlier podcast where we had our electric bill shut off, which of course that runs your whole house. My parents were off in another country visiting my sister, and I could not get our lights. So we were out of power because of our inability to pay the bill for several days. And not only that, but then we also, my wife and I are both just hour by hour workers. We still are, we're still working that stuff out. So in that sense of like financial, like we've never been wealthy people. We've never had the nicest, newest stuff per se. But then on the emotional, relational stuff, it's like, yeah, there's definitely been some dark and challenging experiences and that I've lived through, rejection and a lot of desertion in some areas of friends and family members. I think the area that I've always been strong in, though, I don't know I've had a lot of lack in, is my spiritual, and that's carried me through a lot of those other challenges. I've always, and it's not that I've ever had challenges with the Lord or Scripture or other areas of even sin and things like that. I definitely have my space in there, but that's been one of those things that I've always been has been the counterbalance for me, and those other areas where I've lacked.
I think I've come close to it, but I don't feel like I've ever been impoverished, or in poverty. I think had I been left to my own means, what I could come up with out of relationship with others, that would have happened really easily. When I was going through a difficult time, I became the sole provider, and I was used to being working not full-time hours quite yet, and not high wages either, and then finding myself, how am I going to stay in a house, provide for 2 kids, and I didn't used to think about money. It wasn't a concern. I would just, if I wanted to help somebody, I just give them what it took to help them. Or if I wanted to be generous in some way, I never had to think about it before. Yeah. And so then I found myself with a pastor telling me, let's go over your finances. And that's how I got help. And it was a real eye-opener to me, the things that I had done. I hadn't gone under or anything, but it showed me that my own expectations of what can a person live off of, and what changes I could make. So he was quick to point, well, you don't need to be paying this much on this resource. You can let go of that, and let's take a look at where you can save some money here and there, and just basically rearranged it, but it's still tight. Yeah. It wasn't that it was, just all fun and games that I could just do whatever I want again. But that was probably the closest I've come.
So to get more into our discussion, how has poverty been, from your understanding, how has poverty been historically understood? I did a little research and stuff, and obviously we've read plenty of books and done our own research on it and experiences, but how today poverty, by the government is measured based on income per household, depending on how many people are in the family, right? And so it's strictly financial. But how have you, from your understanding, how has poverty been understood, both maybe in our context, but maybe even, by the church over the centuries? Because the church has had a big heart for helping the poor, but felt the responsibility, like we've talked about in previous conversations, a responsibility for caring for the poor. So how has the church or societies in general understood poverty is?
When I think of in the past, I think that there was more of an automatic response from the church because they understood the mandate to take care of the poor, the widow, the orphan. And so in my mind, if there was, a widow, then the church stepped up and helped that widow make ends meet. If there were orphans, they took them in. This was before the foster care system. That was the response, and it wasn't, nowadays I think the response is more, I don't know if I could do that, or I don't have the training. And back then it was more of a natural thing to do, like your church or the small town you were in, we all come together and take care of those things.
It's almost like the hospitality that maybe was common in cultures of the past was a way of kind of combating poverty and helping those who were in need. That's just what I thought of as you were saying that right now.
When we think about, again, we spoke about this in our last episode as well, talking about the mishpat, or the justice of God, and how he cares for those people groups, the orphan, the widow, the alien, and the poor. Well, this almost is the physical, emotional, relational, spiritual, and built into those people groups. You have the alien who's lacking relationship. You have the poor who's maybe lacking material, and the widow emotional, and then the orphan, probably all four. but in that space, it's like God has set up in gleaning to care for those people groups. And really, if you fast forward into today's modern culture, what is gleaning today? How do we care for these? Well, a big part of the response is government assistance and church hospitality, or church engagement or involvement, or other organization like Love Inc. Engagement has been a big part of answering those questions. But those weren't set up in Deuteronomy when God set up gleaning. He called his individual people to be generous and hospitable. Even when you see Jesus talking about the Good Samaritan, having compassion and showing mercy is at the very heart of the kingdom of heaven. And I think in that place, when we talk about what is poverty, it's something that when we talked about a moment ago, it's like having lack in these maybe few areas. But the answer to the solution to it is the individuals within the church to walk alongside somebody who is in challenging positions.
Yeah, I think of stories from the early church, that especially in the kind of Roman society that the early church was in during that time in history, it was common practice to, when somebody had a child that they didn't want, just throw it outside the city and let the animals come and kill the child. And the church was known for going outside the city walls and taking those children. And I think too, God specifically targets the widow and the orphan and the wanderer, the stranger, the sojourner. And those three different groups of people, types of people, how they really interact, how what their positions are in society, like you were talking about. There's different ways where they're lacking, and God is specifically targeting these people. If somebody was an orphan, they wouldn't have a way of getting the help they need. They were likely in dealing with poverty. Same with a widow, and somebody, a sojourner, a wanderer, a stranger, or an immigrant, right? They are coming with very little, they've probably, everything they have, they've been using to get to where they are. And so they're coming with very little to help them. So again, those are interesting snapshots of how poverty was understood. Without those kinds of typical support somebody would have, they likely would be dealing with challenges like that. So how does our understanding of poverty and what it is affect our response to it. How would you think about, like, if we understand poverty from this holistic kind of perspective that you guys are describing, how does that affect how we in turn respond to it in our community?
I'm thinking of many years back when there was a gas crisis going on, and I started getting gas cards so I could pay for people's gas. And I would go to the gas station and I would help somebody. Or I worked at a church. They would come in and they'd say they needed gas for their car, and I would go to the gas station with them and get their car filled up. And I thought that was pretty cool, and it was a neat way to have a conversation with somebody. But then one day when I was in the office, I overheard a pastor helping somebody in his office, and I could hear him having conversation like, "Well, I know that you need help with this financial thing, but if we help you today, are you going to come back next month in the same situation? We really want to help you in a better way." And that really got my attention. So then I started noticing I'm starting to help the same people every month at the same time at the gas station. It dawned on me. And so I started having conversations with that person. So what happens at this time of the month that you're always coming in need for this? And then I started inquiring, who else lives in your home? And I found out she had very able teenage sons that weren't working, and she was caring for somebody else that she took in. It was nice that she was doing it, but she didn't have the means to pull off what she was wanting to do. And that's when I suggested that maybe her sons could find some work and help. And that was a real eye-opener to me, because I don't think that crossed her mind that they should just be able to receive, and they were old enough. And she said, well, they have a hard time finding work, so then we found some ways that they could get a job easily. But just those kinds of discussions. And so I think it's easy to see a need, and so we can react, but to meet the need in a deeper way, to me, is now my goal, so that someone doesn't need to continue that way each time. And it's been surprising to me as time has gone by, different stories that I've heard. I even think about this, like the person that is in need, many times they feel like they're in need and they have enough for their needs. They don't have enough for the wants that they see everybody else having. And that comes into play as well. Like they get around content people with what they have and are managing well. I think that starts to go away a little bit. Like, oh, you don't have those things either? You still seem happy. Something's different. So I don't know. That's kind of where I land now.
I think there's two things that are kind of going through my mind. And as we're talking about this, at first it was kind of a difficult question to contemplate and to think about. But as I was thinking a little bit more about it, I think there's two parts. So first of all, I think that as Christians, it is an obligation, I think, and almost a mandate scripturally to assist people that are in need. And we obviously, like I just mentioned with the Good Samaritan. So I think that when I look back in Genesis with, it was Exodus. Was it Exodus? Boy, I think it was Exodus. With Joseph, as he was developing, as he was in prison for years, and the baker and the wine taster and all that kind of stuff has this vision. He's now becoming known as a person who can tell dreams. The Pharaoh of the land at the time had these great dreams, and Joseph was brought into before the Pharaoh to be able to communicate what the dream was. And so it was the 7 fat cows, and then 7 lean cows, and then the 7 full grains of wheat, and the 7 grains of wheat that were famished. And so the interpretation of the dream was that there's going to be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of complete drought. Like, we're not going to be able to do anything with that. And so the wisdom was to prepare for the 7 years when there's a want or need. So I think just by understanding that, I think the first part for us to be able to respond is prepare for the person who is in need. Is first, it's like, okay, do I have the means to take care of myself and my family? That's fine. But then do I also have something separate that is for benevolence for my neighbors or for community members or for those that have the sign that are asking for help or assistance, or to Love Inc. Am I putting something aside for an organization or for my church or for whatever? Am I preparing for when there is a challenge? And I remember seeing some beautiful things happen during COVID specifically, that the churches, for the most part, were able to keep their doors open because of the faithfulness of those who were preparing or had the financial backing, the financial means to be able to carry their church through, financially specifically, through that hard time. And I remember there was a few relatives of mine close to me that even were they sent me a few checks because they knew I was being paid by the church, and they didn't know how everything was happening. So they sent a couple of checks my way that was very, very timely and very grateful. So just, I think in that first part of how do we respond to poverty is first, let's get ourselves prepared. Let's be ready for the ask. So that could mean that I've got to get my own financial position in order. I got to get ready for that. And then I think the other part that would accompany that on the other side of the coin is be spiritually ready as well. Is be so attuned to the Holy Spirit that when someone asks you with wisdom and discernment, you can respond in a way that is actually appropriate. And so I think that if we don't have those two things prepared, what I feel could happen, I'm not saying that it does or it is happening, is that we can then have apathy for those who are asking. We can start being negligent to who they are as people. We can start really looking down upon those people who are asking because they're always in need, they're always in want, they're always this. Well, part of it is because no one's come alongside them, gotten off the Good Samaritan gotten off his horse, went down to him and picked him up, put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn and cared for him. Like, who's doing that? And so I won't go into what that question would lead me to, but I think in that space, if we can prepare ourselves for being generous, and then also be very highly attuned to the Holy Spirit saying, go help this person. One of my favorite stories from a book Nick Ripken wrote called The Insanity of Obedience. He talked about this individual who was a pastor. Well, he talked about this family first, I think it was in Russia, that was literally like I think it was a single mom whose husband was a pastor, was in jail. They were get down to their last meal for their night, and last meal in the sense that they were going to die after this. They have no more food, and so she fed her children. They went to bed, just expecting not to wake up, and. In another village, another town several miles away, the Lord woke up a pastor and said, I want you to load your cart with these items to feed this family, and you're going to go right now to go feed them. And he goes, but Lord, it's cold outside, it's dark, I'll go in the morning. And the Lord just would not relent. And then he finally says, well, what if I get lost? I could get this, I could break that. He was making all these, kind of excuses. And he goes, well, there's wolves out. I could get mangled. I could die. Or I might not even come back. And the Lord just spoke to him. He says, I didn't say anything about you coming back. I just told you to go. So in that space of just being obedient to the Lord, when someone comes with a want, whatever that might be, I think is very important to be that. But if you don't have the means also to supply for that request, I think that's the other side. So I think those two things come to my mind when you're asking, like, what should be our response, or how can we respond to people in need?
Yeah. So to kind of wrap up our conversation, how does Love Inc. and the work we do here really try and help the church respond to their neighbors who are dealing with different forms of poverty, in a holistic manner, in a manner that really like understands poverty more than just the material lack.
I think that one of the challenges that we're talking about here is the visibility of it. And so there's a ton of money, millions of dollars and millions of dollars being spent on homelessness in our community because it's so visible. And rightly so. I'm not arguing against it, of course, not at all. And we should do better at that. But it's visible and we see it. What we don't see are the individuals who are suffering. They have maybe jobs, they maybe have a dwelling place, they maybe have a few friends, but they are suffering in other areas. And quite frankly, they're not going to the church for some of those things. And some of them are even within our own church. The thing that the thing that I do love about Love Inc. is that they're calling us. We get several thousand phone calls every single month for people making almost like prayer requests to the church. And so I think in that place, they're also in our questioning and on our application, we're verifying where their need really is and what we need to be addressing first. In our application process, we ask those 4 principles, the physical, emotional, relational, and spiritual neediness. They're always calling for material because that's been their the MO for people in poverty for a long time, so they're calling saying, I need a bed, or I need a this, or I need a that. But during our process in our conversation, we're saying, well, how are you doing in this area of your life? Give me what we ask for, what we call like verifications, but we're asking, saying, give us 2 people who know about your situation. And what that means is that if you're telling somebody about your situation, that means you have trust in them. You have relationships. So we're trying to put a shroud of protection of people around them in their first phone call, and saying that, and even in spiritual, asking them, do you attend a church? What has your spiritual life been in your background? So we're asking all of these questions in a way that they've never been or rarely been asked ever before, because we're trying to make visible what is so easily hidden.
Amen. I think when you start talking about what you can't see, that was one of my biggest concerns when I saw the homeless going inside. My heart, as glad as I was for them to get inside, I couldn't see them anymore. And so, and I remember when I was working more closely with the homeless community, like when people would get upset and they're on display for the whole world to see. Yeah. They have no place to hide their emotional lack, their relational lack. It's just out there. And so people tend to think that the solution is to just, well, if they got inside, they would also eliminate your vision of what's happening. And it's, if you look at studies, there's a lot going on behind closed doors as far as addiction and all those kinds of things that are shocking, even if you were to compare them to those that are outside. And so I like, when I think of Love Inc., it's kind of like we, in a nice way, but we're showing or shining a light on where this need is that you can't see. And I really, really appreciate that. And I know the people that we talk to on the phone appreciate that because they don't feel seen either.
Yeah, I think even in our church culture, often we can have the idea that's not maybe ever explicitly stated, but it's kind of implicit in how we interact amongst one another, that you kind of have to keep your problems hidden. Keep your problems at home hidden away. When you get here, button up, put on a smile, But yeah, we're trying to help the community see, like, no, we all have issues and we all have problems and we all need help from each other. And the people down the street that the church is unaware of because they don't go to church, now we can know about them. Now we can know about our neighbors, and we can share our struggles with them, and they can share theirs with us, and we can support each other.
So that nobody had any lack. I think of that obviously in the book of Acts, and everybody was giving, and everybody was generous with their items, and so that nobody particularly within the church, but that also affects the rest of the community. Nobody had lack. Everybody had support, and I think that is what Love Inc. would be today, would be able to provide the church community. There's roughly about 300 churches within Clackamas County, which of course each one of them having roughly a couple hundred people-ish in there. So we have thousands and thousands of people spread out almost strategically across the county to be able to help other people in need in a very beautiful way. So that's the opportunity moving forward.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for this discussion. Just shedding some light on how we understand this and how that just kind of better shapes what we do as the church to respond to our neighbors who are struggling, our neighbors who have needs, just like we have needs, just like we need support and help from them too. Thank you everybody for watching. Don't forget to check out our blog post that accompanies this video, and like and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes, and we'll see you again next time.